Welcome back to episode 2. I'm your host, Tiffany Silva-Herlin, a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm continuing this conversation with Allison Jenkins, a licensed clinical social worker and the clinical director at Oasis Ascent, a residential treatment program. So we're going to keep this conversation going. In this episode, we're going to talk about how can we improve autism diagnoses for females. We explore the challenges of traditional diagnostic tools, the importance of a thorough evaluation, and how professionals can better identify neurodivergent presentations that they may have. Please remember that this podcast is not a replacement for therapy. Please always seek a mental health professional for your situation. All right, so let's dive into understanding the diagnostic process. So for some of our listeners who may not know, there is a psychological evaluation.
Correct.
Then there's a neuropsych evaluation.
Correct.
Which is even a bigger and more comprehensive one.
Correct.
But those won't cover diagnosing for autism, right? You need an extra one.
You need an extra measure. So there's 3 different measures.
Okay.
One is the ADOS. So the ADOS is a good...
Which is ADOS.
Correct.
Okay, just for our listeners.
Yes, ADOS. And that will help diagnose. There's a brief, it's called. Usually you need 2 measures to get an accurate diagnosis of autism. The ADOS alone is not as valid as if you have 2 measures. So I see a lot of testing where they've done an ADOS and they've ruled out autism. Okay. Well, just because they've done an ADOS, and maybe you have before, maybe you've done an evaluation with your daughter when she was 10, and they've ruled out autism. Okay, well, just the ADOS alone is not good enough to diagnose autism. There's something called a brief, which goes to parents, the clinician, and that is a measure that we fill out, as well as there's something new called a MIGDAS. I'm not too familiar with it. The psychologists I work with, some of them use it, some of them don't. And it's MIGDAS, I believe. So, and in a thorough evaluation, it's not just them interviewing the student. If you ever get a psychologist that says, oh, I'm just going to talk to the student and then come up with a diagnosis, that is not a good psychologist. The psychologist needs to be talking to parents. And the main way for psychologists to help accurately diagnose is a thorough history with the parents. And then they go through all of the developmental stages and they get an accurate picture of what's going on. So that is very important. And then talking to the other providers that are working with the student. If
Probably the teachers too, right?
Teachers too, yeah. If they don't have an outpatient therapist, and if the outpatient therapist is missing it too, then yeah, go to the teachers. And so, that's what makes this process so amazing, is because you're getting a really accurate history on developmental history, on things that they may have masked, right? And so you really have to dive deep into that. So a good evaluation takes time, 6 to 9 hours of face-to-face, and it's usually 2 days. It's usually broke up into 2 days. So I want you all to remember that. Like if you get a psychologist that wants to have your child tested for a full day, that is not going to be accurate. And it's pretty evident as to why, right? It's really hard for a kid to sit there for 6 hours.
Yeah, especially someone who's on the spectrum.
Yeah, especially, or, suspected spectrum. Often, peer reviews are really good to be done with psychologists. So at Oasis, we work with a team of psychologists where they'll produce the report and then they'll give it to one of their peers to do a peer review of it to make sure it's accurate. And it's not just about the scores. There's a lot of face-to-face observations during testing, right? Interviews with the students, getting those nuances, trying to pick up on it. And the hard part is you have to advocate. Don't just go to a psychologist and say, I want a psychological evaluation. You have to advocate for the additional measures because these girls are so good at masking. I've even have psychologists that have been like, I'm asking for an ADOS and I'm asking for a brief. And they're like, well, we don't see it. Why should we do it? I'm like, oh, this is what we're asking for as a team. Like, just because you're not seeing it in your 4-hour interview, these are all the things we're saying. So I feel like in a way at Oasis, we're educating the psychologists too of like, look, just because you sat with them for 4 hours and you're not picking up anything on the spectrum, like we're seeing as as a treatment center, we're watching them 24/7, and this is what we're seeing. So please take what we're seeing seriously. So you need to really advocate.
Which I think some parents are nervous, or, they think, I'm not the expert, so maybe, I'm just going to go with what they say. There's nothing wrong with, I wouldn't say challenging that, but taking those extra measures, say, you know what, just in case, let's just cover all of our bases.
Yes, I really want to get an accurate diagnosis. And if you're seeing all these symptoms, like, keep track of them. Tell them, like, okay, we had 3 big outbursts this week after school. There's weirdness around food, the social cues, keep track of all of these things so you can tell the psychologist and advocate appropriately. And then also, like, going beyond the symptoms, right, and figuring out the function of them. I think we talked about it in the last episode, how symptoms can present as different diagnoses, but if you don't understand the function behind it or the history behind it, I had a girl that came in and totally presented as neurotypical, mass, did great, smiled, nodded, all those things. And then I keep watching her and I'm like, okay, she hasn't washed her hair. Like, her hair's getting greasier and greasier. And then I talked to her parents, and her parents was like, oh yeah, no, she doesn't like to shower. She hates to shower. She won't wash her hair. Okay, those are symptoms, right? So just keeping track of those, of like cues that you can go to the psychologist and advocate.
Those are easy to miss too, or think like, oh, that's just a minor thing.
Yeah, she just doesn't like washing her hair.
Yeah, so yeah,
it's always been that way since she was little. She's always hated to wash her hair.
There's sometimes parents when I'm talking with them or working with them and their child, and they'll be like, oh yeah, by the way, this scene happened, and they'll throw it in after the fact, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that would have been a really important thing that you didn't think was important, that you should have told me, months ago. That would really help guide this conversation and where we're going.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
And that's a really good point. Like, too, if you're thinking of treatment, right, and sending your daughter to treatment, like having a list for the providers of what you are seeing, even things that you don't think are important, they are important.
Or you think aren't related.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So I have a question for you. What role does family input play in the diagnostic process? You've talked a little bit about that, but expound on it.
Yeah, it's interesting because, a lot of parents, when I'll present, like, I think your daughter may be on the spectrum, and parents are very resistant. Some parents are like, oh, there's no way.
Why do you think that is?
A lot of times it's like, oh, we have a family member or a cousin that's on the spectrum that's totally, she doesn't even mirror like that, right? So I think it's like, especially because it's so prevalent genetically, right? So usually there's another family member, a relative that has autism. And I'm going to say, if you've met one kid on the spectrum, you've met one kid on the spectrum. They're all so different. And so there's a lot of resistance because there may be a family member, they may be in denial, right? They may be angry because all of these behaviors have been coming out. And I even had a parent say, oh, so now they can use their autism diagnosis as an excuse for their behaviors. And I'm like, no, I think it helps us understand, right? And so I think, and it's scary too. It's scary to think that at 14, they've missed it, right?
Yeah.
Like, how did I miss it? There's no way I missed it.
Yeah, and I still think there's social stigma around it as well. You know, that people either fearful or shy away from or get anxious about what does that mean?
Right, right.
How do we deal with that?
Can they be functioning adults? Yeah. Is it going to be similar to someone in their family that's on the spectrum that needs a lot of support?
Or did I fail as a parent?
Yes.
If I missed this all this time?
Yeah.
Or what does this mean now for our relationship? Or no, that's not the child I wanted.
Correct.
Right, versus what I have.
A lot of grief. Yeah.
So much grief and loss.
And, and then I always, like, if you think, like when we talked in the last episode about the preconceptions of like borderline personality disorder and autism, right? There's something about parents that feel like borderline or depression and anxiety, it all can be treated, right? And then there's that fear of autism being the way their brain works differently. What in the world happens for treatment, right? And so there's that fear as well.
Yeah.
It's like they want it fixed.
Yeah.
And you can't fix autism.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the way the brain is wired.
Correct.
And it's not trying to shove a square peg in a round hole. You can't do that. You have to adjust and figure out, what they need, which I think is so important. We talked about females being underrepresented in research in our last episode, and maybe even professionals missing and not being as inclusive of neurodivergent presentations and in females especially. And so, really this conversation goes of we need better representation, especially in research. We need it. We need to be talking about this more and educating not only parents, but professionals and everyone that this is something that we're missing.
Yes.
And we're doing a disservice to so many poor young women.
Mm-hmm. I think about all the girls I've treated over the years, and that they left with a borderline personality disorder diagnosis, or borderline traits, and we missed it. And now they're young adults in their 20s, and it just makes me sad that this is just coming out, that we're just finding this, right? Yeah. And the research, we have no research to support it, like little to no research. And so I feel like we're, it's like the Wild West, where we're just trying to navigate how to get accurate diagnoses for these girls so they'll get the right treatment. And I want to pause because a lot of parents are relieved when they hear it. Some parents don't like it, but a lot of parents are relieved because they're like, oh, finally we have an answer. Yeah. And every girl I've told, I will say this, every girl I've told has been like, oh, that makes sense. Every girl. Not one girl has been like, no way. Every girl has been like, thank goodness. Like, they feel like now just they relief. Know what's going on.
Yeah, because it gives you direction.
Yeah.
And clarity of like, oh, I'm not totally off, and I'm not totally crazy.
I'm not this crazy weirdo that doesn't fit in and feels lonely and doesn't,
There's a reason.
Yeah, and so that's the amazing part. That's what I love about my job. It's like not only helping the families, but helping the girls understand, like, you're not a sociopath. You're not, you don't have borderline personality disorder. You don't have, major depression. It's like you have autism, and it really opens their eyes, and it's very powerful. And I'm just really proud. Yeah.
It's got to be so healing for those families and for those young women. Well, how do you help families who are resistant to this evaluation? Yeah,
that's a really good question. I think it's just education and slowly, psychoeducation on how it presents differently. And another barrier is we don't have a lot of research. I can't tell parents to go look up this study or look up that study, right? And so basically it's just encouraging them, helping them understand the symptoms and what they're seeing, and putting a why behind it, right? And just reframing, helping the parents reframe it, and then helping calm their nerves of like, look, they can be successful. You can have autism and be very, very successful, right?
Absolutely.
And these girls, their masking abilities and their social masking that they've developed, like, can really take them far in their lives. They just have to understand, the girls have to understand when to let it down, how they need resets, right? How when they mask a lot, they get really emotionally exhausted. So helping them understand too, like, okay, you're going to mask at this presentation, and when it's over, you're going to be really exhausted.
Yeah.
So you need to reset your brain, and you need to go like be alone and take some time to yourself before you go out and have to mask again at school or wherever you're going.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Can you leave our listeners with a story of a family you've worked with who came in misdiagnosed and what that process looked like?
I had this girl that came in, and she was, one of the question mark kids, right? I call them. And the education consultant called me and said, this girl, she's been diagnosed with bipolar, major depression. Now she's reporting she's seeing hallucinations. She's hypersexual. She's, we're thinking maybe it's bipolar. She's played around with substances before, and we don't really know what's going on with the student. So she came in and, she, with the structure and the schedule, she started thriving, and we didn't see any of the behaviors. She was a big self-harmer at home. She had to have her music 24/7, candy cravings, problems with stomach issues. And, she was one of those girls that had the very intense eye contact. Right? Okay. And, so I started to throw that out there to parents. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I think she may be on the spectrum. And parents were like, no way. And I was like, tell me why. And they're like, because her biological sister, they adopted sisters, is on the spectrum, and she's nothing like her. She's nothing like her. And they were very resistant. So I was like, okay, not only is she showing all these symptoms, her sister, same mother, different fathers, is on the spectrum. So I'm like, okay. And, after doing a thorough battery of testing, and even in the testing, the mom was like, I just don't believe it. I just don't believe it. I just don't believe it. And through the testing process and all the questions, and she was like challenging the psychologist. And these parents were very rigid. So then after, we got the accurate testing back, and I'm doing therapy with her and helping, like, kind of shifting my gears to how do I, do therapy with a girl on the spectrum versus a neurotypical girl. So I was kind of treating it as autism. And, the diagnosis came back, and I told her, she was so relieved. The mom was still no buy-in, right? And so I worked really hard with the parents and went through kind of all of the testing and went through all of the symptoms and what we're seeing. And again, like the one kid on the spectrum, there's one kid on the spectrum. You've met one kid on the spectrum, and helping, just doing education with parents. And at the end, when they left, and they had a aftercare set up that was designated for neurodivergence, and they got her into some ABA therapy that was very helpful with her, and she's thriving now. Doing so well. They just reached out and a year later and said, she's doing really well. She has special accommodations in school. She's attending school every day. She's learning about her brain. They're learning about how her brain works. And another funny thing is she really hated her sister. Rigid, right? She's working really hard with her sister.
That's awesome.
She's horse jumping.
What a fantastic story to share with our listeners, that there is hope.
There is so much hope.
Yeah.
And this was a girl that the ed consultant had said to me, she's going to need long-term.
Really?
She's going to need long-term.
Yeah.
And I was like, she went home after 90 days.
Yeah. For our listeners, Oasis is a residential treatment program that is a short-term residential treatment program. Some kids do go home, and some kids go on to get further treatment, just depending on their needs. But so what a fantastic story.
Oh, yeah. And then when the parents started understanding her quirks and helping her and, and buying in, then they were like, oh yeah, now we totally see it.
They could see it finally.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, we see it. It's different than her sister, and it's still autism, right? Yeah. And it's like helping them understand. But when they started putting together the pieces, right? Like, oh yeah, she is so rigid. She's just rigid in different ways. Yeah. I'm like, yeah. And so it was just fun. It's just, I love it. I love this work and helping families understand.
I can tell that you absolutely are passionate about this topic and passionate about helping those you work with. And I love the phrase that you said, even I think in the previous mini series we did, of that if you've met one person on the spectrum, you've met one person on the spectrum, because that is so true, having worked with many.
Yep.
To summarize what we've talked about is what parents can do if they suspect that their child may be misdiagnosed and may need an autism spectrum diagnosis, or at least need a battery, and what kind of testing they can ask for and advocate for. And in our next episode, we'll be talking about moving forward. What is life like after an autism diagnosis? And so stay tuned, listeners, and thank you again for joining us.